And a big g'day to everyone there in the Wurdale Landcare, and good luck with your water planning session. It's Graeme Anderson here, just with an update on climate and weather and why planning for water is very important. So here we've got a long-term rainfall record from Winchelsea, goes back to 1899, and this line through here is the long-term average 548 millimetres. So you can see some years very wet, over 800 mils some years, and some years barely gets to 300 mils. So a lot of variability in there. You can see some of those bigger droughts. You can also see in the last 20 years we've had 6 years that have been wetter than average and 14 drier, and that's probably a pattern that is right across Victoria. You can also see since the 50s there were a number of wetter decades there, so water was less of an issue perhaps in those few decades than it is now. You can look back at the longer term and around the Federation drought in World War One and Two. There were a run of dry years there, so even a repeat of some of that that's happened in the past would put additional pressure on our water systems here. This is the same record for Winchelsea, but just split up into summer, autumn, winter, and spring. You can see the long-term histories there. Plenty of variability in amongst all of that. Probably the one I'll point out is just that autumn breaks, and autumn's one season which is perhaps a bit different these days. Autumn breaks being less reliable. They're great when we get them, but less reliable than they once were, and that's part of that important wetting up of the catchments when it comes to water flow. The key drivers behind our wetter and dry years, down here you can see this part of Victoria. We're at the crossroads of some big weather climate drivers. So the southern inland mode is really strong winds drives all of these cold fronts that flick their tail across southern Australia. Important trigger for rain, but the wetter years are really when we're getting a lot of extra moisture out of the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So in those wetter years, we get good flow of moisture coming in, hits the cold air down south, and that's why we live in a zone of pretty reliable rainfall. Sometimes the weather, the pattern turns drier, and in an El Nino year, there's less moisture coming out of this part of the world, and that doubles the chance of a dry spring down in our part of the world. And the Indian Ocean dipole is also an important climate driver. Some years it sends us lots of moisture, like 2016 it was in its wetter phase and sent moisture down, and again it hits that cold air. So that's a pretty important, these climate drivers. They're right behind our variability, and we provide commentary on those each year. But also we'll just talk a little bit about some of the increasing drier pattern, which is to do with these cold fronts that just tend to be slipping south a bit more often. So we've got good old-fashioned variability. Is there anything different happening? So one thing that is a bit different is temperatures. This is maximum temperatures for Victoria for the last 100 years for summer, autumn, winter and spring. You can see a lot of variability there, but the last couple of decades have been warmer than those before, and even especially spring, where you look at the last 10 years, has been a number between 1 to and even 3 degrees warmer. So the Bureau described this as we're basically squeezing in an extra month of summer. So while we'll continue to have rainfall variability, in the background here we've been squeezing in an extra month of summer, and that actually puts in extra pressure on our water resources and evaporative demand and things like that. So that's why water storage only gets more important. One of the reasons for I guess the sort of drier pattern, especially those drier autumn breaks and everything over Victoria, has been blamed on an increasing pressure pattern. So this has been measured, an increasing pressure pattern over southern Australia, and you can see here this is the pressure for southern Australia since 1950. It goes up and down depending on seasonal variability, but certainly since the late 90s the pressure has sort of gone up and not come back to some of its old historic levels. So that's largely what they expect to continue with climate change, and part of why we'll need to get better at planning for water. And just looking at local catchments, here's a reference stations from down in the Otways, but just shows sort of inflows, and that's the average, in those decades post the 50s. But since sort of 97, a lot of our creeks and streams have found a new sort of longer term average, which is a bit dry, and that's consistent, right across from Western Australia. There's a lot of our catchments that are running less water, so it puts more emphasis on what do we do on our properties to manage this less flow. And the Barwon water sort of saying even since 96 average annual inflows into the West Barwon Reservoir have fallen by almost 40%. So it's an issue whether it's for urban water or for agriculture. And there's a fair bit of work been going on looking at this, but largely with seasonality of rainfall and our climate zones, they are shifting south, and this was some work done Recently just showing rainfall in the last 15 years, what were clearly the winter dominant rainfall zones as opposed to the uniform zones where rain falls throughout the year through the summer dominant. All of those zones have shifted south, and so largely with climate change, they're expecting those sort of climate zones to keep shifting south. So that's part of the new battle that everyone's trying to plan for. Lots of things though that are in control of farmers and property owners. So we've got lots of good R&D and technologies and innovations which we can use. Also improving infrastructure both on farm and regional, especially with regards to water and fodder storage, really important. Lots of important to make sure we're keeping good biosecurity, access to global markets, and business variability to deal with sort of more variable years has been a key thing. Good farm planning, which includes water, which is what you're talking about today, that's important, and also just surrounding yourself with good sources of knowledge and information so that people can adapt and work out what are the innovations to use on your farm together. So I hope that gives a quick insight. If you're interested in commentary on seasonal forecasts, we provide monthly updates via the Break newsletter. So just drop an email to this address here, and we can give you monthly updates on what Indian Ocean Dipole and El Nino and everything else up to. Also, if you're interested in some of the science behind climate, just Google the climate dogs. There's some good short animation showing the big things that affect our weather. So all the best with your water planning session.